"Daddy, we have your birthmark," the Maid'S triplets shouted to the sterile millionaire. When he saw the girl's wrists, he went into shock. The hospital corridor stretched out like a labyrinth of hopelessness, with its peeling walls painted in a faded green that once tried to convey serenity, but now only reflected abandonment. The cracked plastic chairs lined up against the walls, occupied by people waiting with faces marked by worry and fatigue. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the odor of medications hung in the heavy air, while the constant noise of hurried footsteps echoed across the worn linoleum floor. Sarah walked quickly among the patients, her white shoes making a rhythmic sound against the floor, carrying a tray with medications. Her brown hair was tied in a simple bun, with some rebellious strands escaping around her young face, already marked by early responsibility. At 22, she had been working the night shift for 3 years, since her mother had been diagnosed with a chronic illness that required expensive and constant treatments. "Nurse Sarah, I need you to check on the patient in bed 15, said a colleague passing hurriedly through the corridor, holding a clipboard full of papers. "And then, please, organize the medications in the West Wing." Sarah nodded with a tired smile, adjusting the white apron that covered her simple uniform. She had learned to work efficiently, even when fatigue weighed on her shoulders, as every penny of her salary was essential to keep her mother's medications up to date. The public hospital didn't offer the best working conditions, but she dedicated herself to each patient as if they were a member of her own family. Her delicate but firm hands moved with precision as she checked the vital signs of an elderly lady who slept restlessly. The fluorescent light flickered intermittently above her head, creating dancing shadows that seemed to follow the accelerated rhythm of her heart. Even exhausted, Sarah never let her tiredness show to the patients, always maintaining a gentle smile and words of comfort. "Everything will be fine, Mrs. Eleanor." "The medication is already taking effect," whispered Sarah, carefully adjusting the patient's pillow. "Tomorrow you will feel much better, I'm sure." It was almost 3 in the morning when screams echoed through the corridor, breaking the relative tranquility of the early hours. Sarah quickly raised her head, seeing 2 security guards carrying a young man who was bleeding profusely. He was unconscious with expensive stained clothes, and his dark hair was disheveled, revealing a face that even pale maintained aristocratic features. The security guards were shouting for help, and Sarah immediately dropped everything she was doing, running toward them. Her nursing instinct spoke louder than any protocol, and she began giving precise instructions while quickly assessing the injuries. The man had wounds on his forehead and arms, but what worried Sarah was his debilitated condition and irregular breathing. Without hesitation, she pressed a clean towel against the head wound while shouting for someone to call the doctor on duty. "Bring a stretcher now, and someone prepare saline solution immediately," ordered Sarah, her firm voice cutting through the general panic. "This man has lost a lot of blood and needs urgent care." The doctor on duty arrived a few minutes later, but it was Sarah who had stabilized the patient, controlling the bleeding and constantly checking his vital signs. During the care, she noticed details that others didn't perceive. The man's hands were soft, without calluses from heavy work, and an expensive gold watch adorned his wrist. Even more intriguing was the small crescent moon-shaped birthmark, partially covered by blood. Sarah worked with total concentration, ignoring the fatigue weighing on her eyes, focused only on saving that life. When the man was finally stabilized and taken for observation, she remained beside the stretcher, checking if everything was okay. Only then did she notice that her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that still ran through her veins. She had saved many lives throughout her 3 years at the hospital, but something about that man deeply intrigued her. "You were amazing in there, Sarah," said Dr. Matthews, washing his hands in the nearby sink. "Without your quick intervention, this man could have died before we even arrived." A week passed since the accident, and Sarah couldn't get the mysterious man out of her thoughts. She had discovered that his name was Richard, and that he was admitted to the most expensive private room in the hospital, which confirmed her suspicions about his privileged financial condition. During her shifts, she found excuses to walk down the hallway where his room was, always hoping to glimpse how he was recovering. On the 7th day, while she was organizing medications near the nursing station, she heard soft footsteps behind her. When she turned around, she found Richard standing, still with a bandage on his forehead. but already much better. He was taller than he had seemed when he was injured, with broad shoulders that filled out the hospital shirt well. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black, and when he smiled at her, Sarah felt her heart race in a completely different way from the adrenaline of work. "You're the nurse who saved my life the other night," Richard said, his deep and soft voice echoing through the silent corridor. "I wanted to personally thank you for everything you did for me." Sarah felt her face flush, briefly looking away before meeting his eyes again. There was something about Richard that made her nervous, but it wasn't fear. It was an attraction she had never felt before. He seemed genuinely grateful, and when he extended his hand to greet her, Sarah noticed how warm and firm his hands were. They talked for a few minutes about his recovery, and Sarah was impressed by his kindness, so different from the arrogance she expected from someone clearly wealthy. Richard asked questions about her work, showing genuine interest in her routine and the challenges she faced at the public hospital. When he casually mentioned that he would return the next day for a follow-up exam, Sarah felt a strange anxiety mixed with anticipation. Even though they were from completely different worlds, there was an inexplicable connection between them. "I hope to see you again tomorrow, Sarah," Richard said, pronouncing her name in a way that made her heart skip a beat. "You have a special gift for taking care of people." The following weeks brought an unexpected routine for Sarah. Richard began showing up at the hospital with increasing frequency, always with some plausible excuse: headaches that needed to be checked, stitches that seemed inflamed, or simply to thank her again for the assistance he received. Sarah knew he was inventing reasons to see her, but she couldn't bring herself to mind. On the contrary, she began to anxiously await his visits, fixing her hair a little more carefully on days she suspected he might appear. During these 2 months of casual conversations, she discovered that Richard was heir to a family empire. But contrary to what she imagined, he was humble and interested in meeting people from different social realities. He talked about his business with passion, but always brought the conversation back to her, asking about her dreams and aspirations. Sarah felt seen and valued in a way she had never experienced before. "Have you ever thought about going to medical school?" Richard asked during one of his visits, observing how Sarah cared for other patients with dedication. "You have a natural talent that should be developed." Richard's question touched on a dream that Sarah had buried long ago. She had always wanted to be a doctor, but financial circumstances forced her to work right after high school to help with household expenses. Seeing Richard recognize her potential awakened feelings she didn't know still existed. In the months that followed, they began to talk more openly about their lives, and Sarah discovered that despite all his wealth, Richard carried his own emotional scars. He talked about the constant pressure of being an heir, about the suffocating expectations of his mother Margaret, and about how he felt alone even when surrounded by people who were only interested in his money. Sarah listened with genuine attention, offering words of comfort that seemed to deeply touch his heart. She began to see beyond the wealth, discovering a sensitive and caring man who yearned for real connections. Time allowed a deep trust to develop between them, something neither of them had experienced before. "Sometimes I feel like my entire life has been planned by other people," Richard confessed, sitting in one of the corridor chairs during a night visit. "With you, for the first time, I can just be myself." It was during one of these intimate conversations, after 4 months of growing closeness, that Richard revealed something that would completely change Sarah's perspective on him. They were sitting in the small hospital garden, a modest space with a few benches and plants that offered a refuge from the constant bustle of the corridors. The full moon softly illuminated his face when he began to talk about a diagnosis he had received at 18. With a hesitant voice, Richard told her about a rare medical condition that had left him sterile, a discovery that had deeply shaken his future plans and his self-esteem. He explained how this revelation had affected previous relationships with women who walked away when they discovered he couldn't give them children. Sarah listened in silence, feeling her heart contract with compassion for his suffering. When he finished speaking, there were tears in his eyes, and Sarah instinctively took his hand. The trust he placed in her at that moment was the result of months of building a solid foundation of friendship and mutual respect. "Richard, this doesn't define who you are," Sarah said in a soft but firm voice, squeezing his hand between hers. true love is much greater than any physical limitation. Sarah's response revealed the purity of her heart and the depth of her feelings that had grown over these months of togetherness. She showed no pity or discomfort, but rather a complete acceptance that touched Richard in a way he had never experienced before. In that moment, under the soft moonlight, they kissed for the first time, a kiss full of tenderness and silent promises. Sarah felt she had found the love of her life, someone who valued her for who she truly was, not for her appearance or social status. Richard, in turn, discovered in Sarah a woman who loved him unconditionally despite his limitations. They began to meet secretly in the hospital garden during Sarah's breaks, sharing dreams, fears, and plans for the future. The social difference between them seemed irrelevant when they were together, lost in conversations that lasted for hours. Sarah knew she was taking a risk by becoming romantically involved during work hours, but the love that had slowly blossomed over 5 months was stronger than any fear. "I don't care what people will say," whispered Sarah during one of their secret meetings, nestled in Richard's arms. "What I feel for you is too real to be hidden forever." Unfortunately, their love didn't remain secret for long. After a month of secret meetings in the garden, during a night when Richard was holding Sarah in his arms and they were talking about a future together, a cleaning lady saw them through the window. The woman, known for spreading gossip throughout the hospital, immediately recognized Richard as the rich man who had been treated months before. Her eyes gleamed with malice as she realized the compromising situation, and she quickly slipped away, already planning with whom she would share this juicy information. The news spread like wildfire through the hospital corridors, passing from employee to employee until it reached the ears of influential high society people who attended charity events at the hospital. In less than 24 hours, the gossip had reached Margaret, Richard's controlling mother, through a friend who served on the hospital board. The mansion's phone rang insistently until Margaret answered, listening with growing horror about her son's romance with a simple nurse. "A nurse? My son with a nurse?" Margaret shouted into the phone, her voice echoing through the walls of the luxurious mansion. "This will end right now!" Margaret's furious scream echoed off the marble walls of her mansion like the roar of a wounded beast. She paced back and forth in her private office, her high heels rhythmically striking against the noble wooden floor, while holding the phone with enough force to break the device. Her grey hair was perfectly arranged in an elegant bun, but her dark eyes shone with a fury that few would dare to challenge. Margaret had built her empire alongside her late husband, through manipulation, control, and systematic elimination of any threat to the family's power. The idea that a simple nurse from a public hospital could seduce her only son and heir was an insult she would not tolerate. Immediately after hanging up the phone, she opened her contact book and dialed the most efficient and discreet private investigator in the city, a man who had provided services to her family for more than a decade, always with impeccable results and total confidentiality. Margaret was not a woman who left things to chance, and each of her moves was calculated to completely destroy her enemies. "I need everything about a nurse named Sarah who works at the Central Public Hospital," Margaret said with a cold, calculating voice. "I want to know where she lives, who she lives with, how much she earns, what debts she has, and especially what weaknesses I can exploit to end this relationship once and for all." 3 months had passed since that fateful call, and Margaret had built a complete dossier on Sarah's life that rivaled police investigations. The investigators discovered about the sick mother who depended on expensive medications, the constant financial difficulties, the multiple jobs Sarah had tried to maintain before achieving stability at the hospital, and especially the emotional vulnerability of a young woman who had grown up without a father and assumed adult responsibilities very early. Margaret studied each detail like a general planning a decisive battle, identifying exactly where she should attack to completely destroy the threat that Sarah represented. During this period, she discreetly prevented Richard from knowing about the investigation, maintaining casual conversations with her son to monitor the development of the romance without arousing suspicion. Her investigators were so efficient that they managed to map Sarah's complete routine, including work hours, daily routes, people she talked to, and even her facial expressions during different times of the day. Margaret knew the time to act was approaching when investigators reported changes in Sarah's behavior, including visits to medical clinics and alterations in her eating routine. "Mrs. Margaret, we've discovered something you need to know immediately," the investigator said during an urgent call that came on a grey morning. "The nurse has been seen leaving a gynecological clinic several times in recent weeks, and our medical sources confirm she's receiving prenatal care." The news hit Margaret like lightning, and she had to sit in her leather armchair to process the information that completely changed the nature of the threat. The possibility that Sarah was pregnant transformed an already unacceptable situation into a crisis that threatened not just the present, but the entire future of the family and the legacy she had spent decades building. Margaret knew about Richard's medical condition, the devastating diagnosis he had received at 18 that she had kept as a family secret, protected by multiple confidentiality agreements with doctors and specialists. If Sarah was claiming to be pregnant by Richard, it could only mean one of two things. Either she was attempting the most audacious scheme in family history, or she had betrayed Richard with another man and was now trying to use the pregnancy to secure a comfortable financial future. In both scenarios, Margaret saw not just a threat, but a golden opportunity to definitively destroy the relationship and expose Sarah as the adventuress she believed the young woman had always been. Immediately, she instructed the investigators to obtain a complete copy of the test results through strategic contacts in the medical field, using methods that bordered on illegality, but which she considered absolutely necessary to protect the family patrimony. "I want all the details about this pregnancy by tomorrow morning," Margaret ordered, already planning her attack strategy, "and arrange a meeting with our best lawyers specialized in family extortion cases." When the medical results reached Margaret's hands, confirming not just the pregnancy, but a multiple gestation of triplet girls, she experienced a cruel satisfaction she hadn't felt in years. The situation was so absurdly improbable that it practically presented itself as automatic evidence of fraud. A poor nurse claiming to be pregnant with triplets by a provably sterile man was exactly the kind of desperate farce she expected from someone in a desperate financial situation. Margaret spent the entire night studying Richard's medical documents, collected over years of treatments and consultations, creating an irrefutable dossier that would prove the physical impossibility of paternity. She contacted the three most intimidating attorneys from her personal law firm, men known for their cruelty in wealth protection cases and specialists in psychologically breaking people who threatened their millionaire clients. The strategy was meticulously elaborated. Sarah would be summoned under the pretext of a legal matter related to the family, exposed to evidence of her attempted fraud, publicly humiliated, and forced to sign documents that would permanently separate her from Richard. Margaret knew that a naive young woman without financial resources would have no way to resist the pressure from experienced lawyers armed with irrefutable medical evidence. "Perfect," Margaret murmured, organizing the documents in separate folders like ammunition for the battle she was about to wage. "An impossible pregnancy of triplets will be the very noose around this adventuress's neck." While Margaret meticulously plotted her revenge, Sarah was experiencing the most intense and confusing conflict of her life. The discovery of her pregnancy had been simultaneously an indescribable joy and an absolute terror that kept her awake for entire nights, trying to process a reality that seemed impossible according to everything Richard had told her about his medical condition. For weeks she struggled with severe morning sickness that prevented her from working properly, having to invent creative excuses for her constant absences at the hospital, always afraid that someone would discover her secret before she could fully understand what was happening. The fear of telling Richard completely dominated her thoughts, not because she doubted the deep love he felt for her, but because she knew how the news of an impossible pregnancy could shake a man who had spent years accepting his sterility condition. Sarah spent entire nights sitting on the edge of the bed, imagining different scenarios of how she would reveal the pregnancy, always ending her fantasies with Richard rejecting the possibility and accusing her of infidelity or lying. The medical discovery that she was expecting triplet girls made everything even more complicated and surreal, as it was such a rare situation that even she had difficulty believing the test results. "How will I explain to Richard something that even I can't understand?" Sarah whispered to herself during sleepless dawns. How will I convince him that these babies are his when all the doctors said he cannot have children? During her prenatal follow-up medical consultations, Sarah repeatedly asked the gynecologist if there was any possibility of error in the tests, if the equipment could have detected non-existent heartbeats, if a rare medical condition could be creating false positives in the pregnancy tests. The doctor, experienced and patient, explained in detail that the tests were conclusive and that she was definitely expecting 3 healthy babies, but Sarah continued struggling to accept a reality that contradicted everything she believed she knew about the man she loved. She knew she needed to tell Richard as soon as possible, as hiding the pregnancy was becoming physically impossible due to the constant nausea and changes in her body. But each passing day made the conversation more frightening and difficult to initiate. Sarah reached the point of rehearsing the conversation in front of the mirror, trying to find words that sounded convincing and loving, always failing to create a speech that didn't seem like an accusation that he had lied about his medical condition. The weight of the secret was destroying her mental peace and affecting her ability to maintain normalcy in her relationship with Richard. Perhaps he has recovered from the condition and doesn't know it, Sarah thought, clinging to any explanation that could make the situation less impossible. Maybe the doctors were wrong in the past, and now we'll finally discover the truth. It was on a rainy, melancholic Tuesday morning that Sarah received the phone call that would change her life forever in a way she could never have imagined. The voice on the other end of the line was formal and intimidating, almost robotic, from a secretary who identified herself as a representative of a law firm located in the most noble and expensive area of the city, a place Sarah knew only extremely wealthy people could hire. The woman explained with professional coldness that they needed to urgently speak with Sarah about a confidential matter of extreme importance directly related to Richard's family, and that her presence was mandatory and urgent that same afternoon, with no possibility of rescheduling or negotiation. Sarah felt a chilling shiver run down her spine, intuitively sensing that something terrible and threatening was about to happen, although she couldn't imagine exactly what it might be. She desperately tried to obtain more specific information about the reason for the summons, questioning if Richard was okay, if there had been an accident, if she had made some mistake at work, but the secretary was evasive and almost rude, repeating only that it was a matter of extreme importance and confidentiality that absolutely could not be discussed over the phone. After hanging up with trembling hands, Sarah sat motionless on her bed for almost an hour, trying to process what that mysterious and threatening call could mean for her life and relationship. If it were something good, Richard himself would have contacted me, Sarah reasoned, feeling panic growing in her chest. This can only mean they found out about my pregnancy, but how? The law firm majestically occupied 3 complete floors of a glass and steel building in the heart of the city's most exclusive financial district, a true monument to power, money, and intimidation, strategically built to impress and psychologically diminish anyone who dared to challenge their millionaire clients. Sarah nervously rode up to the 15th floor in a mirrored elevator that reflected her image multiple times, multiplying her feeling of vulnerability and social inadequacy as she observed her simple and inexpensive clothes contrasting with the oppressive luxury environment. The reception was decorated with imported black leather furniture, contemporary artwork that cost more than her house, and a polished black marble desk where a cold blonde secretary observed her with barely disguised contempt, evaluating every detail of her appearance with critical and judgmental eyes. Sarah felt completely out of place and humiliated in her nicest dress and worn-out shoes, painfully aware that each person in that environment earned in 1 month more than her entire annual salary. When she was finally called to enter the meeting room after a deliberately long and uncomfortable wait, she found 3 men in dark, expensive suits sitting intimidatingly behind an imposing mahogany table, their serious, hostile, and calculatedly cruel faces creating an oppressive criminal court atmosphere. The lead attorney, a man of approximately 50 with perfectly combed grey hair and gold-rimmed glasses that reflected the artificial light, coldly gestured for her to sit in the only available chair, strategically positioned to make her feel small, isolated, and psychologically vulnerable. "Ms. Sarah, thank you for responding so promptly to our call," said the lead attorney with an icy voice, leafing through a thick folder full of documents. "We are here exclusively representing the interests of Richard's family, and we have extremely serious and grave matters to discuss with you." The next 20 minutes were the most humiliating, terrifying, and devastating of Sarah's entire life. The lawyers systematically presented an extensive series of documents that detailed her personal life with an invasive and shocking precision that left her completely horrified. Her constant financial difficulties, her sick mother's expensive and essential medications, her multiple poorly paid jobs over the years, even photographs of her leaving the hospital in recent months, secretly taken by private investigators without her knowledge or consent. They spoke about her as if she were a dangerous and calculating criminal, coldly questioning her real motives for approaching Richard, and maliciously suggesting that she had planned from the first moment to seduce him exclusively for financial interest and social opportunism. The lead attorney then opened a second, even thicker folder, revealing with cruel satisfaction detailed copies of Sarah's medical exams, obtained through completely illegal methods and serious violations of medical privacy, announcing that they knew perfectly well about her pregnancy and all the prenatal consultations she had made. The expression of absolute shock and terror on Sarah's face was immediately interpreted as an admission of guilt by the men, who smiled with predatory and cruel satisfaction that made her blood freeze. When she tried to speak, desperately explaining that her relationship with Richard had been genuine and based on true love from the beginning, she was rudely interrupted before she could complete a single full sentence. "We are not interested in your elaborate lies, Ms. Sarah," said the lead attorney, slamming the folder on the table with intimidating force. "We have concrete and irrefutable evidence of your attempt to pull a millionaire scam against our family." The lawyers then presented the final and devastating psychological blow, extremely detailed and official medical documents conclusively proving Richard's permanent sterility, definitively diagnosed at 18 and rigorously confirmed by multiple renowned specialists over several years of treatments and specialized consultations. The papers contained technical reports, laboratory tests, biopsy reports, and fertility assessments that painted an absolutely clear and incontestable medical picture. Richard was physically and biologically incapable of having children due to a rare congenital condition that had been diagnosed, treated, and monitored by the best male fertility specialists in the country. I felt the world literally crumble around Sarah as she read the medical documents that contradicted everything she believed about her situation. The technical words of the medical reports danced before her eyes as she struggled to process the information that Richard was actually proven and definitively sterile, not just a temporary or treatable condition as she had secretly hoped. During all the months of deep and loving relationship, she had blindly believed that their love could overcome any obstacle, but had never questioned or investigated the real truthfulness of his medical condition, accepting his word as absolute and unquestionable truth. As you can clearly observe in these official documents, it is medically and biologically impossible for Richard to be the father of the baby you are expecting, said the lawyer, hitting the documents on the table with force that made Sarah jump in surprise. "This makes your claim not only completely false, but criminally fraudulent, legally characterizing an attempted large-scale extortion against our family." Sarah felt her entire world collapse like a house of cards as the cruel and relentless reality imposed itself before her with devastating force. The accusatory words of the lawyers echoed in her mind like a surreal and terrifying nightmare, and she desperately struggled to process the impossible information that she was pregnant with triplets by a man who provably could not be the biological father. During all the months of loving and intimate relationship, she had been absolutely faithful to Richard, never even considering the possibility of being with another man, as her heart and body belonged completely to him since their first kiss in the hospital garden. Now, facing official and irrefutable medical documents, she found herself in an apparently impossible and inexplicable situation, pregnant with 3 babies by a man who could not have created these children, at least according to all the scientific evidence presented before her. She tried to explain with a trembling and desperate voice that she had been completely faithful to Richard, that she had never been intimately with another man in her entire life, that he was her first and only true love, but her voice came out as a weak and unconvincing whisper that the lawyers completely ignored with evident disdain. They continued their systematic and cruel accusation, claiming that she had deliberately become pregnant by another man and was maliciously trying to use Richard to secure a comfortable financial future through emotional blackmail and family extortion. "I swear by everything sacred that I have never been with another man. Richard is the only man I have ever loved and touched in my entire life," Sarah cried desperately, tears of despair running down her face. "I don't know how to explain this impossible situation, but I know he is the father of my daughters, even if it seems medically impossible." The specific mention of the triplets made the three lawyers laugh with cruel disdain and evident mockery, as if the situation had become even more absurd and obviously fraudulent in their eyes. They explained with cutting sarcasm that a multiple pregnancy of 3 babies made her story even more dramatically unlikely and clearly invented, suggesting that she had created this specific detail to make her claim more emotionally dramatic and financially convincing to a wealthy family. They explained that they had the resources to legally contest any claim, and that her mother could also be involved in the investigations, which would result in significant financial and social consequences for both. "We have all the necessary resources to ensure that you are convicted and spend the next 10 years in jail," said the second lawyer with a cruel smile. "Your sick mother will also be investigated as an accomplice, as she certainly knew about the plan from the beginning." The direct and specific threat against her mother was the final emotional blow that completely broke Sarah's psychological resistance, as she could not bear for even a second the idea that her supposed naivety and genuine feelings for Richard could somehow harm the only family she had left in the world. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was completely cornered in an impossible situation, without financial resources to hire a competent lawyer or legal knowledge to fight against such a powerful and ruthless family. The combination of the shocking discovery about Richard's proven sterility, the accusation of being a calculating criminal, and especially the concrete threat to her mother's health and safety created an unbearable psychological pressure that left her without the capacity to think clearly or fight for her rights. She intuitively knew that people with so much power and financial resources could easily fulfill their threats, transforming her life into a legal hell that would last years and consume any chance of future happiness. The image of her mother being interrogated by police, accused of crimes she didn't commit, suffering even more with her already precarious health condition, was enough to make Sarah accept any agreement that would protect the woman who had sacrificed so much for her over the years. "Please leave my mother out of this," Sarah begged between uncontrollable sobs. "She knows nothing about my relationship with Richard. She is innocent and very sick." With violently trembling hands, Sarah was forced to read word by word the legal document that would officially and permanently end her life with Richard and destroy any chance of future happiness. The contract was detailed, extensive, and deliberately cruel, requiring her to formally confess in writing that she had completely invented the relationship out of pure financial interest, that she publicly admit to having intentionally become pregnant by another man and maliciously tried to deceive Richard about the paternity, and that she legally renounce forever any type of contact with him or any member of his family. There were specific and detailed clauses that prevented her from talking about the relationship publicly, through media, social networks, or any other means of communication, from seeking out Richard in the future for any personal or professional reason, and even from continuing to reside in the same city where he lived, effectively condemning her to permanent exile. Sarah knew with absolute clarity that signing that paper meant accepting a lifetime of exile, public humiliation, and emotional solitude. But the alternatives presented by the lawyers were infinitely worse and more destructive. She thought about her mother, who completely depended on her for physical and financial survival, and about the 3 innocent daughters growing in her womb who didn't deserve to be born in prison or grow up in absolute misery caused by a legal battle she had no conditions to win. "This document also includes a perpetual silence clause," explained the third lawyer, pointing to a specific section. "Any violation will immediately result in criminal prosecution and automatic imprisonment." With her heart literally broken into thousands of small and painful pieces, Sarah took the golden pen offered by the lead lawyer, her abundant tears blurring the expensive ink as she slowly signed each page of the document that destroyed her dreams. Each individual signature was like a deep stab in her heart, and in her hopes for happiness, each word she legally accepted was a renunciation of everything that had made her life meaningful in recent months. She signed her own confession of being a calculating criminal, signed the admission of having betrayed the only man she had ever loved, signed away the right to see or speak to Richard again, signed the agreement to leave the city permanently like a fugitive. When she finished signing the last page, she felt as if she had signed her own emotional death certificate, as she knew that the woman Richard had loved had officially ceased to exist in that moment, replaced by a distorted and criminal version created by the lawyers. The men collected the documents with evident satisfaction, like hunters who had captured their prey after a long and meticulous chase. "Very wise, Ms. Sarah," said the lead lawyer, putting the papers in a leather folder. "Now we'll take care of informing Richard about your true nature." The lawyers then presented the final and cruelest blow of the entire operation. They had drafted in advance a personal and intimate letter supposedly written by Sarah herself, explaining to Richard that she had confessed to using him emotionally and that she had chosen to leave permanently with another man who was the true biological father of the child she was expecting. The letter, written on expensive letterhead and with handwriting that perfectly imitated hers through professional graphological analysis, painted Sarah as a calculating, self-interested, and emotionally manipulative woman who had deceived Richard since their first meeting at the hospital with the specific goal of gaining access to the family's wealth. The fake document described in detail how she had planned every moment of the relationship, how she had faked all feelings of love and affection, how she had deliberately seduced Richard to later blackmail him with a fake pregnancy, and how she was now leaving with her true lover to live a comfortable life far away. As Sarah read the devastating content of the forged letter, she felt as if she was reading about a completely different and evil person, a distorted and cruel version of herself that had absolutely no resemblance to the truth of her genuine feelings or her pure intentions. "This letter will be personally delivered to Richard today," the lawyer informed, carefully folding the paper, "ensuring that he will never look for you or question your sudden departure." With her heart completely shattered and her soul destroyed, Sarah realized the final cruelty of her situation. She was not only losing the love of her life forever, but Richard would spend the rest of his existence firmly believing that she had never truly loved him, that everything had been an elaborate and cruel lie from the first moment. The idea that the man she loved more than her own life would forever carry the belief that he had been betrayed and used by a calculating and self-interested woman was a pain much deeper than any physical suffering she could imagine. Sarah knew that Richard would remember every kiss, every sweet word, every intimate moment they had shared, but would now interpret everything through the lens of betrayal and lies, believing that every gesture of love had been a calculated performance to deceive him. The fake letter would ensure that he would never question the version of facts presented by the lawyers, never search for the truth, never discover that she had been forced to lie to protect the people she loved. "He will hate me forever," Sarah whispered, returning the letter with hands trembling like leaves in the wind. "He will never know that I loved him more than my own life, that every moment by his side was the most real and true of my existence." Days after signing the devastating documents at the law office, Sarah walked the city streets like a ghost, carrying the weight of humiliation and forced betrayal. The extreme emotional stress, combined with her high-risk pregnancy and malnutrition, caused by days without being able to eat properly, made her body react violently. While waiting for the bus that would take her away from the city, a searing pain in her abdomen made her double over in pain, followed by hemorrhaging that stained her clothes and caused her to faint on the sidewalk. Compassionate passers-by called an ambulance, and seeing her precarious state and the absence of documents indicating local family, a retired nurse named Eleanor offered to take her to her boarding house in the countryside, where she could recover away from the problems of the big city. Sarah awoke 3 days later in an unfamiliar bed, in a small and simple room that smelled of lavender and maternal care. The walls were painted in a light blue faded by time, decorated only with a wooden crucifix and a framed photograph of a smiling family. The small window let in a soft light that illuminated flowered cotton curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked softly under the weight of the careful steps of an elderly woman approaching the bed. Sarah tried to get up, but a searing pain in her abdomen made her moan and lie back down, instinctively placing her hands on her belly to protect the lives growing inside her. The woman, with grey hair tied in a loose bun and kind eyes marked by the wrinkles of wisdom, approached with a bowl of hot broth and a maternal smile that radiated genuine compassion. She introduced herself as Eleanor, owner of the small family boarding house, where Sarah had been brought by neighbors who witnessed her fainting in the city and took pity on a pregnant young woman in a situation of despair. "My daughter, you've been unconscious for 3 days, delirious about a man named Richard," said Eleanor, supporting Sarah so she could drink the broth. "Whatever happened in your life, now you're safe here with us." In the following days, while slowly recovering from the physical and emotional trauma, Sarah told Eleanor an edited version of her story, omitting the most painful details about the humiliation at the law firm and the fake letter that destroyed her reputation. She explained that she had become involved with a wealthy man whose social differences made the relationship impossible, resulting in a pregnancy that she now needed to face alone. Eleanor, who had raised 5 children and knew the difficulties of motherhood, didn't ask invasive questions, respecting the evident pain in the young woman's eyes. The countryside town where Sarah had arrived was small and quiet, with dirt roads and simple houses, where everyone knew each other and helped one another in difficult times. Eleanor offered Sarah a room in exchange for work, explaining that she needed someone to help with sewing and embroidery that she sold at the local fair. Sarah gratefully accepted, knowing she had no other options and needed a safe place to give birth to her daughters. During the first weeks, she still secretly hoped that Richard would discover the truth and come looking for her. But as the days passed without news, the cruel reality of her situation became increasingly clear. "Richard must be hating every memory of us after that terrible letter," thought Sarah, touching her growing belly. "He'll never know that I truly loved him, that these babies are the fruit of our love." The following months tested Sarah's physical and emotional resilience in ways she never imagined possible. Working as a seamstress at home, she spent hours bent over delicate fabrics, embroidering wedding dresses and christening clothes for families in the region, her fingers becoming painful and swollen from the repetitive work. The payment was minimal, just enough to cover her stay and some basic necessities, forcing her to make difficult choices about food and medical care. Her multiple pregnancy required special nutrition that she simply couldn't afford, resulting in a restricted diet consisting mainly of rice, beans, and occasionally a piece of chicken when Eleanor managed to negotiate a special price at the market. Sarah ate only 1 complete meal a day, saving the rest of the money for medical emergencies and preparations for the birth of the triplets. Her health began to be affected by excessive fatigue, frequently feeling weak and having difficulties maintaining her intense work routine. Eleanor observed with growing concern Sarah's physical state, offering extra food whenever possible, but respecting the young woman's pride, who insisted on paying for her own stay. "Sarah, you need to eat more, dear. These babies need proper nutrition," Eleanor insisted, placing a plate with more food on the table. "Don't worry about payment now. What's important is for you and the children to stay healthy." Prenatal medical consultations became a constant source of anxiety and guilt for Sarah. The town doctor, an elderly and experienced man who had been attending to the local population for decades, expressed growing concerns about the development of the triplets and the mother's precarious health. The exams showed that the babies were smaller than expected for their gestational age, a clear sign of intrauterine malnutrition that could result in premature birth and health complications. Sarah knew she should be taking special vitamins, having more frequent exams, and maintaining a diet rich in proteins and nutrients, but her limited resources made it impossible to follow all medical recommendations. Each consultation became a painful reminder of her inadequacy as a mother, even before her daughters were born. She cried silently in the small room, feeling guilty for not being able to provide the best for the children she carried, constantly comparing her precarious situation with the life of luxury she could have offered if circumstances were different. The cruel irony of having lost a wealthy man who could give everything to her daughters, only to discover that he really couldn't be their father, tormented her thoughts daily. "Doctor, please tell me honestly, "Will my babies be born healthy despite all these difficulties?" asked Sarah during a consultation, her hands trembling with anxiety. "I would give anything to be able to take better care of them, but this is all the help I can offer now." The birth of the triplets happened on a rainy and stormy night, 2 weeks before expected, when Sarah was alone in the small room preparing baby clothes she had sewn with fabric scraps donated by Eleanor. The contractions began suddenly, intense and painful, making her immediately realize that something was happening earlier than expected. Eleanor rushed to call the doctor, while Sarah struggled with pains that seemed to tear her body apart, frightened by the intensity of the premature labor. The doctor arrived quickly, but the precarious conditions of the boarding house made the delivery even more challenging, without adequate equipment or sufficient medication to ensure the complete safety of the mother and babies. The 3 girls were born small and fragile, weighing less than 2 kilograms each, with lungs not yet fully developed that made them cry with weak, high-pitched voices. Sarah held them in her arms for the first time with tears of joy mixed with terror, immediately realizing how small and vulnerable they were, needing special care that she would have difficulty providing. Emma, Jessica, and Alice were identical, with thin, dark hair, rosy, translucent skin, and most striking of all, each carried a small moon-shaped birthmark on their right wrist, exactly like the mark Richard had on his neck. "They are perfect, Sarah. 3 little angels who will bring much joy to your life," said the doctor, carefully examining each baby. "But they will need extra attention in the first weeks due to their premature birth." The first months of the triplets' lives were a test of endurance that pushed Sarah to the limits of her physical and emotional capacity. Caring for 3 premature babies simultaneously required 24-hour dedication that left little time for rest, proper nutrition, or personal care. Sarah established a rigorous feeding routine every 2 hours, constant diaper changes, and careful monitoring of the girls' body temperature, who had difficulty maintaining warmth due to their low weight. She slept an average of 2 hours per night, always interrupted by cries that demanded immediate attention, whether for feeding, diaper changing, or simply the comfort of maternal arms. The small room transformed into an improvised infirmary, with 3 simple wooden cribs built by Eleanor, piles of cloth diapers that Sarah washed by hand daily, and bottles of milk she prepared with the little money she could save from her sewing work. Her health deteriorated drastically during this period, with marked weight loss, severe anemia that left her dizzy and weak, and physical exhaustion that affected her ability to think clearly or make adequate decisions. Eleanor helped whenever possible, but had her own responsibilities with the boarding house and could not completely take over the care of the babies. "Sarah, you need to rest more, dear. There's no point in working yourself to death if you can't properly care for the girls," Eleanor warned, observing the extreme paleness of the young mother. "Let me help more. You don't need to carry everything alone." As weeks turned into months, Sarah developed a survival routine that bordered on heroic, but was clearly unsustainable in the long term. She woke before dawn to sew while the babies were still sleeping, taking advantage of every minute of silence to work and ensure some income. During the day, she divided her time between caring for the triplets and finishing embroidery orders, frequently working with 1 baby in her arms while the other 2 slept in alternating shifts. Her meals consisted of leftovers she ate quickly between activities, often just bread with sugared water, when money was especially tight. The girls grew slowly, but Sarah noticed that their development was delayed compared to other babies their age, a direct consequence of inadequate nutrition during pregnancy and the first months of life. She constantly blamed herself for not being able to give her daughters what they deserved, mentally comparing her precarious situation with the life of luxury they could have had if circumstances were different. During lonely early mornings, when she cradled a crying baby while the other 2 slept restlessly, Sarah frequently caught herself imagining what it would be like if Richard knew of his daughter's existence and could help care for them. "My girls, you deserve much more than I can offer," Sarah whispered, gently kissing each one's forehead. "But I promise I will never give up on you, even if it costs me my own life." Social and emotional isolation weighed as heavily as physical and financial difficulties. Sarah had no friends in the small town, only superficial acquaintances who treated her with the reserved politeness typical of rural communities when faced with outsiders. She desperately missed meaningful adult conversations, someone who could understand her concerns and fears about motherhood, an emotional support network that would help her process the trauma of having lost Richard in such a cruel and unfair way. The letters she mentally wrote to him during sleepless nights were never put on paper, as she knew that any contact would violate the legal agreement she had signed and could result in disastrous consequences. Eleanor offered what she could in terms of company and maternal advice, but the generational difference and the specific circumstances of Sarah's situation created a natural barrier to deeper confidences. During the months of intensive care for the triplets, Sarah often felt as if she were living in an isolated bubble from the rest of the world, where only she and the three girls existed in a parallel reality of daily survival. Sundays were the most difficult days emotionally, when she saw complete families walking to the local church, proud parents carrying their children, united couples facing the challenges of parenthood together. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choices, if I should have fought harder for the truth, Sarah thought, watching the girls sleep peacefully. But how could I risk your lives and Grandma's because of my wounded pride? The 8 months of solitary care for the triplets transformed Sarah into an unrecognizable version of herself, physically debilitated but emotionally strengthened by motherhood. Her body, which had already suffered from multiple pregnancy and premature birth, showed evident signs of extreme wear, weight loss that left her skeletal, lusterless hair that fell in strands, pale and dry skin from chronic malnutrition, and deep dark circles that testified to sleepless nights. Her hands, once soft and well cared for, were now calloused from constant sewing work and intensive care for the babies, with broken nails and fingers marked by small needle cuts. Despite the evident physical deterioration, there was an iron determination in her eyes that didn't exist before, a maternal strength that kept her functioning even when her body begged for rest. The triplets, now 8 months old, had developed into 3 distinct personalities, despite their identical appearance. Emma was the calmest and most observant, Jessica the most active and curious, and Alice the most affectionate and dependent on her mother's lap. Sarah knew every nuance of their temperaments, every type of cry, every individual preference and need, creating a deep connection that partially compensated for the absence of other significant relationships in her life. "You are my strength, girls. When I think I can't go on anymore, I look at you and find energy I didn't even know existed," Sarah murmured, organizing the little clothes she had sewn during the early morning hours. "We are a tiny family, but we are a complete family." It was on a particularly difficult rainy Saturday morning that Sarah's body finally succumbed to the accumulated exhaustion of 8 months of absolute dedication to her daughters. She had woken before dawn, as always, to take advantage of the quiet hours for sewing, but felt a more intense dizziness than usual and a weakness in her legs that made her need to lean on furniture to walk. The triplets had spent an especially restless night, crying alternately and demanding constant attention, resulting in less than an hour of sleep for Sarah. During the morning, while trying to prepare bottles and organize the diapers washed the day before, she noticed that her vision was blurred and her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Emma began to cry intensely, followed by her 2 sisters, creating a symphony of infant despair that echoed through the small room. Sarah tried to get up quickly to attend to the girls, but the sudden movement caused an overwhelming dizziness that made her stagger and lean against the wall. Determined to care for her daughters regardless of how she felt, she walked unsteadily to the improvised kitchen in the corner of the room, where she tried to prepare food while the world spun around her in nauseating waves. "Calm down, girls. Mommy will take care of you soon," Sarah said in a weak voice, trying to concentrate on preparing the bottles. "I just need a minute to get everything right." Exhaustion finally overcame her. Sarah felt dizzy and needed to sit down, realizing she had reached the limit of her strength. She fainted softly, her body demanding the rest that she had denied for so long that had been masked by maternal adrenaline and pure willpower. The triplets, instinctively sensing that something was wrong with the sudden absence of maternal presence, intensified their cries until they became desperate screams that echoed through the silent boarding house. Eleanor, who was preparing breakfast in the main kitchen, heard the prolonged and strange cries coming from Sarah's room and ran up the wooden stairs, concerned about the unusual intensity of the baby's despair. When she opened the bedroom door, she found Sarah sprawled on the floor next to the portable stove, completely unconscious, while the three girls cried desperately in their cribs, extending their small arms toward the mother who did not respond to their calls. The scene was heartbreaking. Three helpless babies crying out for the only person they knew as safety and protection, while that person lay motionless on the cold floor. "Someone call for help. She's not responding and the babies are alone," Eleanor shouted desperately, kneeling beside Sarah to check if she was still breathing. "Please, someone come quickly." Eleanor found Sarah unconscious on the floor of the small room, surrounded by the desperate cries of the triplets, who stretched their little arms toward their unconscious mother. The rush to the town hospital was distressing, with Sarah being carried in a precarious ambulance, while Eleanor held the three babies in her arms, trying to calm them during the chaotic journey along the countryside dirt roads. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed severe extreme anemia, acute malnutrition and complete physical exhaustion that had led Sarah's body to total collapse. During the 5 days she remained hospitalized, connected to IVs and receiving blood transfusions, Sarah had time to reflect on her unsustainable situation and make a decision that would completely change the course of her life. She realized that, as much as she loved the tranquility of the countryside and Eleanor's kindness, she could not continue living in those precarious conditions without irreversibly harming the development and future of her daughters. The small town offered no job opportunities that would allow an adequate income, nor the medical or educational resources that the triplets deserved and needed to grow healthy and have real chances in life. With a broken heart, but determined to give her daughters a better life, Sarah made the painful decision to return to the capital, even knowing that it would mean facing again the city where she had lost Richard and where her reputation had been shattered by Margaret's ruthless lawyers. "Eleanor, I need to go back to the big city. Here I can't give my daughters what they deserve," Sarah said with tears in her eyes, holding the hand of the woman who had been her salvation. "You gave me a second chance in life, but now I need to fight for a better future for them." 8 long years had passed since Sarah returned to the capital with the triplets, settling in a distant peripheral neighborhood where the cost of living was lower and where she hoped not to meet anyone from her past. The house she managed to rent with her minimal savings was a simple 2-room construction, with exposed brick walls, a roof that leaked during heavy rains, and old furniture donated by compassionate neighbors who recognized the struggle of a single mother raising 3 daughters. The small bedroom was shared between Sarah and the triplets, with a single bed where she slept, and 3 thin mattresses on the floor where Emma, Jessica, and Alice spent their nights, covered by patched blankets that Sarah constantly sewed and resewed to keep them functional. The kitchen was a tiny space with a 2-burner stove, a small refrigerator that worked intermittently, and a cracked Formica table where they had their meals and where the girls tried to do their homework under the dim light of a lamp hanging from the ceiling. The bathroom was shared with the neighbors in the back, a situation that required constant organization and infinite patience, especially during rushed mornings when Sarah needed to prepare the 3 girls for school before leaving for her multiple jobs. Despite the precarious conditions, Sarah had transformed that small space into a home full of love, decorating the walls with her daughter's drawings and keeping everything clean and organized with an obsessive care that compensated for the lack of material resources. "Girls, I know our house is small and simple, but here we have everything that is most important. Love, unity, and hope," Sarah would say every night, kissing each one before bed. "One day we'll have a bigger house, with separate rooms and everything you deserve." The psychological trauma caused by the devastating events at the law firm had left deep marks on Sarah's ability to practice her original profession. She tried to return to work as a nurse in the first months after returning to the capital, but found that she could no longer handle hospitals, medical environments, or emergency situations without having panic attacks that left her completely incapacitated. The memories of the day she saved Richard, of the development of their relationship in the hospital corridors, and especially of the humiliation suffered at the hands of the lawyers, created a traumatic association that made it impossible for her to remain in any hospital environment. Forced to abandon the career she had studied for, and in which she was competent, Sarah had to accept cleaning and housekeeping jobs, a painful transition that represented not only a drastic reduction in income, but also a wound to her pride and self-esteem. She worked in 3 different places: a commercial building during the early morning hours, a medical office during the mornings, and family homes during the afternoons, an exhausting routine that began at 4 in the morning and ended at 8 at night. Even working tirelessly 14 hours a day for 6 days of the week, the income was insufficient to cover all the family's basic needs, forcing Sarah to make impossible choices between adequate food, school supplies for the girls, and medicine when one of them got sick. Why does life have to be so hard? I work so much, but it never seems to be enough to give dignity to my daughters, Sarah thought during the long bus journeys between one job and another. They deserve so much more than I can offer with these tired hands. The triplets, now 8 years old, had developed distinct personalities that flourished despite constant financial difficulties. Emma was the most studious and responsible, often helping her sisters with lessons and taking on small household responsibilities to ease her mother's burden. Jessica was the most extroverted and brave, always defending her sisters when they faced difficult situations at school and dreaming big about a future different from their current reality. Alice was the most sensitive and artistic, constantly drawing on any paper she found and creating elaborate stories that she told to entertain the family during difficult times. The 3 girls were intelligent, caring, and united by an unbreakable bond that helped them face daily adversities. But Sarah noticed that poverty was beginning to affect their self-esteem and opportunities at school. They attended a public school in the neighborhood, where they wore patched uniforms that Sarah mended every week, carried donated backpacks that showed obvious signs of prolonged use, and often lacked basic school supplies, such as notebooks, pencils, or books needed to properly follow classes. The situation was especially painful because the triplets were excellent students, with high grades and exemplary behavior, but their socioeconomic conditions created invisible barriers that limited their opportunities to fully participate in school life. "Mum, why can't we buy new books like the other kids in our class?" Emma asked one afternoon, showing a list of school supplies. "The teacher said we need to have all these books to do the activities for next month." The daily humiliations that the triplets faced at school became a constant source of anguish for Sarah, who saw her daughters come home crying almost every day due to cruel comments from classmates about their clothes, school supplies, and living conditions. Emma reported that other students made jokes about her worn-out shoes that Sarah had mended with glue and tape, mocking the fact that she had to wear boys' shoes because they were cheaper and more durable. Jessica tearfully recounted classmates who refused to sit near her during lunch because her sandwich was always the same, just bread, while other children brought elaborate and varied lunches prepared by mothers who had time and resources. Alice, the most sensitive of the 3, particularly suffered from comments about her drawings made on reused papers and with pencils worn down to the nub, being constantly compared with classmates who had expensive and new art materials. Each account of humiliation was like a stab in Sarah's heart, who felt completely powerless to protect her daughters from social prejudice and the childish cruelty that reflected the economic inequalities of society. She spent sleepless nights imagining ways to improve their situation, calculating and recalculating the family budget in hopes of finding some way to provide the girls with a more dignified life, less marked by constant deprivation. "We don't care what others say, Mom. We know you're doing the best you can for us," said Jessica, hugging Sarah after a particularly difficult day at school. "But sometimes it hurts so much when they laugh at our things." Sarah cried in hiding almost every night, sitting on the floor of the small bathroom after the girls fell asleep, allowing herself a few minutes of silent despair before composing herself to face another day of struggle. She felt like a completely inadequate mother, unable to provide her daughters with the basic necessities that other children considered normal, such as new clothes, toys, outings, or even varied and nutritious food. Guilt consumed her constantly, especially when she observed the intelligence and potential of the triplets being limited by circumstances beyond her individual control. Sarah knew that the girls deserved opportunities to develop their talents, participate in extracurricular activities, have access to books and adequate educational materials, and most importantly, grow with their self-esteem intact. and the confidence that they could achieve any goal they desired. The cruel reality was that despite all her heroic efforts, she couldn't offer even the minimum conditions of dignity that her daughters deserved, a failure she interpreted as personal inadequacy rather than recognizing it as a consequence of an unjust social system. During the early morning hours working in empty commercial buildings, Sarah often found herself imagining what it would be like if circumstances were different, if she had managed to maintain her nursing career, if Richard knew of his daughter's existence and could help raise them. "Why am I so weak? Why can't I give my daughters a better life?" Sarah questioned herself, wiping tears with hands calloused from work. "They are so special, so intelligent, and I'm failing as a mother every day." It was on a particularly difficult afternoon, when all three girls came home crying simultaneously due to an especially cruel episode at school, that Catherine, the elderly neighbor who lived in the house next door, decided to intervene more directly in the situation. Catherine was a 70-year-old retired woman who had raised 6 children alone after being widowed young, and who recognized in Sarah's struggle echoes of her own past battles. She frequently helped with small favors, such as looking after the girls for a few hours when Sarah needed to work extra hours, or sharing a pot of food when she noticed the family was going through especially severe financial difficulties. That afternoon, seeing Sarah trying to console the 3 sobbing daughters as they recounted the day's humiliations, Catherine crossed the small yard separating the 2 houses and knocked on the door with determination. She found Sarah sitting on the living room floor, embracing the triplets who hid their faces in her lap, all crying together in a scene that would break the heart of anyone with a minimum of sensitivity. Catherine sat down beside the family, offering hugs and words of comfort, but mainly listening attentively to the girls' stories about their classmates' cruel comments and the feeling of not belonging in the school environment due to obvious socio-economic differences. "Sarah, dear, you cannot continue destroying yourself like this. These girls need a strong mother, not one who blames herself for things beyond her control," said Catherine, running her hand through Sarah's hair with maternal affection. "You are a wonderful mother, and it's time we find a real solution to this situation." Catherine had been keeping a newspaper advertisement for weeks that she considered a perfect opportunity for Sarah, but had hesitated to show it due to the specific nature of the job and what it might represent emotionally for the young mother. The advertisement was for a live-in housekeeper position in a high-society mansion, a job that offered significantly better pay than multiple cleaning jobs, plus the invaluable advantage of including adequate housing for the entire family. The position required full dedication, taking care of a large mansion and attending to the needs of a wealthy family, but offered in return financial stability, a decent place to live, and most importantly, the possibility for the triplets to attend better schools in the upscale neighborhood where the property was located. Catherine knew that accepting such a position would mean a radical life change for Sarah, who would have to leave her relative independence to work and live in the home of wealthy strangers, a situation that could be emotionally challenging. However, observing the family's daily suffering and recognizing that the current situation was unsustainable, she decided it was time to present this alternative, even if it was risky or painful. "Look, Sarah, I've kept this advertisement for a few weeks because I wasn't sure if I should show it to you," said Catherine, carefully unfolding the newspaper. "But seeing you all suffer like this, I think it might be a real opportunity for life change." Sarah read the advertisement with growing attention, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension that made her heart race with possibilities she dared not imagine. The job offered a salary 3 times higher than the sum of all her current jobs, plus complete housing in a staff residence on the property, meals included, and the possibility of her daughters attending private schools in the upscale neighborhood with scholarships for employees' children. The position description was detailed: managing a large mansion, organizing occasional social events, keeping the property in perfect order, and attending to the needs of a family that traveled frequently and needed someone reliable to keep everything running properly. Sarah mentally calculated that, even working for a demanding family, she would have more quality time with her daughters than in her current routine of 14 daily hours divided among multiple jobs. The possibility of the triplets attending quality schools, having access to proper materials, and especially escaping the daily humiliations of poverty was too tempting to ignore. She knew that accepting would mean giving up her independence and privacy, living on the property of rich people who could be demanding or difficult, but compared to the current situation of constant deprivation, it seemed like an opportunity she couldn't waste. "Catherine, do you think I have a real chance of getting this job? Would they hire a single mother with 3 young daughters?" asked Sarah, rereading the advertisement for the 3rd time. "It seems too good to be true, but maybe it's exactly what we need to restart our lives." The interview was scheduled for the next morning, and Sarah spent the entire night preparing with an obsessive care she hadn't shown in years. She washed and ironed her only formal outfit, a navy blue ensemble she had bought to work at the hospital years ago that still fit adequately, and organized all the documents she might need, including references from her current jobs and certificates from her nursing courses. The triplets woke up early to wish their mother good luck, hugging her enthusiastically and promising to behave well at school while she was gone. During the long bus journey to the upscale neighborhood where the interview would take place, Sarah mentally rehearsed her answers, preparing for questions about her experience, family situation, and availability for full-time dedication to the job. She was nervous, but also hopeful in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, imagining the real possibility of her daughters having access to opportunities that could completely transform their futures. The interview took place at a sophisticated employment agency that exclusively served high society families, an elegant environment that initially intimidated her, but where she was received with respectful professionalism. Surprisingly, she was hired almost immediately after a conversation of only 30 minutes, apparently impressing the interviewers with her previous hospital experience, her evident dedication to her daughters, and her genuine need for stable employment. "Congratulations, Sarah, you're hired. The family was very impressed with your profile and immediate availability," said the interviewer, handing her an envelope with the job details. "You can start next Monday, and here's all the information about the property and your new employers." When Sarah opened the envelope and read the complete address of the mansion where she would work, her blood literally froze in her veins. The address was on a street she knew intimately, in the same upscale neighborhood where Richard had lived years ago, just a few blocks from the area where she had imagined a happy future with the man she loved. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably as she processed the cruel irony of fate that was taking her back to the geographic location where her life had been shattered, now in the position of a domestic employee of the same people who frequented Margaret's social circles. The possibility of encountering Richard, or people who knew him, or worse yet, Margaret herself, made her stomach churn with anxiety bordering on panic. Sarah knew she had changed a lot over the 8 years. She was thinner, with shorter hair, marks of fatigue on her face, and dressed as a domestic worker instead of the young, hopeful nurse she had been. But still, the risk of being recognized was real and terrifying. She briefly considered giving up the job, inventing some excuse and continuing in the current routine of deprivation and struggle, but the image of her daughters coming home crying every day made her overcome the fear. "It's the same neighborhood where he lived," whispered Sarah, terrified, her hands trembling so much that she almost dropped the paper. "How can fate be so cruel as to bring me back to the place where everything began and ended?" When Sarah arrived home that afternoon, carrying the news of her hiring mixed with the terror of the job location, she found the triplets organizing their few clothes for the move they knew was being planned. Emma had taken the lead, instructing her sisters on how to properly fold clothes and which toys were priorities to take. Jessica was excited about the prospect of a new house and a different school, constantly asking questions about what it would be like to live in a large property. Alice, always more sensitive to her mother's emotions, immediately noticed that Sarah was disturbed by something specific, approaching her with evident concern in her large, expressive eyes. While Sarah tried to process her conflicting emotions about the job and location, Emma was rummaging through the old suitcase, where they kept the family's few important belongings, looking for documents her mother had asked them to organize. At the bottom of the suitcase, beneath baby clothes that Sarah had kept as mementos, Emma found an old photograph that had been forgotten for years. The photo showed Sarah and Richard together in the hospital garden, smiling happily during the first months of their relationship, both young and in love, unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. "Mom, who is this handsome man with you?" "Why does he have a mark like ours on his neck?" Emma asked innocently, showing the photograph where Richard's birthmark could be clearly seen on his neck. "He looks very happy in the photo, and you two are looking at each other as if you were very much in love." Sarah looked at the photograph in Emma's hands, feeling as if time had completely stopped around her. Richard's young and loving face gazed at her from the yellowed paper, bringing back a flood of painful memories she had tried to bury for the past 8 years. Emma's innocent question about the birthmark hit Sarah like lightning, reminding her that her daughters carried the physical proof of a paternity that the whole world believed to be impossible. With trembling hands, she gently took the photograph and quickly tucked it back into the bottom of the suitcase, trying to control the irregular breathing that threatened to turn into a panic attack. Emma, Jessica, and Alice watched their mother with growing curiosity, noticing her extreme reaction to a simple question about an old photo. Sarah knew she needed to give her daughters an explanation, but how could she tell the truth without destroying their innocence or creating hopes that could result in even more pain? During some tense minutes, she struggled to find adequate words that would satisfy the girls' natural curiosity, without revealing secrets that could put the entire family in danger if mentioned at the wrong time or to the wrong people. "Girls, this man in the photo was someone very special to Mommy a long time ago, but things didn't work out between us," said Sarah, controlling her voice to not reveal the desperation she felt. "It's very important that you never comment about this photo or about your birthmarks with strangers, okay?" The triplets accepted their mother's vague explanation with the typical trust of 8-year-old children, but Sarah could see in Emma's intelligent eyes that the girl wasn't completely satisfied with the answer. During the following days, as they organized the move to their new life, Sarah constantly reinforced the importance of silence about personal family matters, explaining that rich people were sometimes complicated and that it was better to maintain a respectful distance regarding private issues. She made up stories about how domestic employees needed to be discreet and professional, turning her guidance into a lesson about social etiquette instead of revealing her specific fears. The girls, excited about the prospect of a new house and better schools, promised to be well-behaved and discreet, without fully understanding why their mother seemed so anxious about the new job. Sarah spent sleepless nights imagining possible scenarios. What if Richard still lived in the neighborhood and she ran into him on the street? What if the family she would work for knew about the events of the past? What if someone recognized the triplets and asked inconvenient questions? Each possibility terrified her, but the reality of the current situation, her daughters suffering daily humiliations, and her killing herself with work without being able to provide basic dignity, was even worse than the fears of the future. "Mom, are you okay? You've seemed worried since you saw that photo," observed Jessica, always the most straightforward of the three. "We promised to be well-behaved in the new house. You don't need to be afraid." Monday arrived with a fine rain that made the air heavier and increased the anxiety Sarah had been feeling since the moment she woke up. She put on her new uniform, a simple but dignified outfit provided by the employment agency, and organized the few pieces of luggage they would take to the staff house on the property. The triplets were excited, constantly asking questions about what the new house would be like, if they would have a room just for themselves, if the new school would be big and beautiful. Sarah answered mechanically, her mind focused on the address that would take her back to the neighborhood where her life had been shattered years ago. During the bus ride, she watched the familiar landscape unfold through the window. The wide, tree-lined streets, the enormous houses protected by high walls, the well-maintained gardens that displayed a wealth she had only known as a visitor when she was dating Richard. The irony of returning to that world as a domestic employee instead of the passionate wife she had dreamed of being did not escape her painful perception. When they got off the bus at the corner indicated by the agency, Sarah felt her legs trembling as she perfectly recognized the neighborhood where she had walked hand in hand with Richard, dreaming of a future that never materialized. "Wow, Mom, the houses here are huge. It looks like a princess castle," exclaimed Alice, pointing to the impressive mansions that lined the street. "Are we going to live in a place like this?" When Sarah saw the imposing gate of the property where she would work, with its ornate wrought iron bars and marble pillars that supported a name engraved in golden letters, her heart almost stopped beating. The name was Richard Mansion, and she immediately recognized not only the architectural style, but also specific details of the facade that she had seen in photographs Richard had shown her years ago when he talked about his family home. The cruel reality imposed itself with devastating force. She was not just working in the same neighborhood where Richard lived, but in his very house, the property he had inherited from Margaret, and that he now managed alone as a widower and sole heir to the family empire. Sarah leaned on the gate, feeling dizzy and nauseous as she processed the impossible coincidence that fate had architected. The triplets observed their mother with concern, realizing that something was very wrong, but unable to understand what could cause such an extreme reaction in front of a beautiful house. Sarah knew she should turn around, make up some excuse and flee that situation before it was too late. But the memory of her daughters crying every day due to humiliations at school made her gather courage to ring the bell and face the consequences of her decision. My God, how is this possible? Of all the houses in this city, I ended up working exactly in his, thought Sarah, her hands trembling uncontrollably. I need to control myself and find a way to make this work, for the girls. An elderly and kind employee opened the gate and led them through the meticulously maintained gardens to the main house, where Sarah was to present herself before being taken to the staff house at the back of the property. During the walk, she kept her head down and instructed her daughters to do the same, desperately hoping not to encounter Richard in that first moment when she was emotionally unprepared for the confrontation. The staff house was a separate but comfortable building with 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen and bathroom, an unimaginable luxury compared to the 2-room shack where they lived in the outskirts. The triplets ran through the new rooms with genuine joy, marveling at the space cleanliness, and especially the fact that each had a real bed instead of mattresses on the floor. Sarah quickly organized the few clothes they owned, trying to create a sense of normalcy, while her mind worked frantically to create survival strategies in the impossible situation she found herself in. She explained to the girls that they should stay in the staff house during their mother's working hours, playing in the small private garden or watching the old television in the bedroom, and under no circumstances should they approach the main house without express permission. Girls, remember what we talked about. Here you need to be discreet and cannot leave this area without telling Mommy first, instructed Sarah, checking the door locks. The main house is for the employers, and we stay here, in our special corner. The first week passed in a state of constant tension that left Sarah physically exhausted and emotionally drained. She discovered through other employees that Richard frequently traveled for business, spending only a few days per month on the property, which gave her a false sense of temporary security. When he was absent, Sarah worked efficiently, cleaning and organizing the immense mansion with an obsessive care that impressed the other employees. The house had changed little since she had visited it in thought through Richard's descriptions. The antique and expensive furniture, the artwork on the walls, the library where she had imagined they would read together, the garden where she dreamed her daughters would someday play. Each room was a painful reminder of dreams that never came true, but she forced herself to work methodically, transforming pain into motivation to do impeccable work. The triplets adapted quickly to the new routine, playing in the designated area and occasionally helping their mother with small cleaning tasks. Sarah managed to enroll them in the neighborhood private school through the scholarship program for employees' children, and for the first time in years, they came home telling positive stories about kind classmates, attentive teachers, and interesting activities instead of reports of humiliation and social exclusion. "Mom, the new school is amazing. The boys are polite and the teacher said I have special talent for mathematics," reported Emma, excited about the first day's news. "Finally, I can focus on studies instead of worrying about what others will say about my clothes." It was on a rainy Thursday, when Sarah thought she had established a safe and controllable routine, that fate decided to accelerate events in a dramatic and inevitable way. Richard unexpectedly returned from a business trip, arriving at the mansion during a morning when Sarah was cleaning the upper floor and the triplets were playing in the staff house. She heard the sound of the car in the driveway and ran to the window, immediately recognizing the male silhouette emerging from the luxury vehicle. 8 years had passed, but Richard remained unmistakably the same man she had fallen in love with, tall, elegant, with the same dark hair and aristocratic bearing that had always impressed her. He looked more mature, with some lines around his eyes that suggested responsibilities and perhaps accumulated sorrows, but he continued to be the most handsome man she had ever seen. Sarah hid behind the curtains, watching him walk through the entrance with the same confidence as always, her heart beating so hard that she feared the sound could be heard throughout the floor. She knew she needed to avoid him at all costs, at least until she could mentally prepare a strategy to deal with the situation, but the mansion wasn't large enough to indefinitely hide an employee who needed to work in all rooms. "He is here in the same house as me, breathing the same air," thought Sarah, leaning against the wall to calm herself. "How will I manage to work normally knowing he could appear at any moment?" The situation became even more complicated when Richard organized an important business meeting at the mansion for that same afternoon, inviting investors and business partners to discuss the expansion of the family businesses. Sarah was instructed to prepare the house to receive the illustrious guests, organizing the meeting room, preparing an elaborate coffee service, and ensuring that every detail was perfect to impress people accustomed to the most refined luxury. During preparations, she worked like a shadow, always alert to sounds that indicated Richard's presence, hiding in adjacent rooms when she heard his footsteps or his familiar voice giving instructions to other staff. The proximity was terrifying, and at the same time painfully nostalgic, as his voice hadn't changed at all, still carrying the same deep and gentle tone that had won her over years ago. Sarah obsessively focused on work, polishing silverware until it shone, arranging flowers with millimetric precision, and repeatedly checking every detail to ensure everything was impeccable. She instructed the triplets to remain absolutely quiet in the staff house during the afternoon, explaining that very important people would be on the property and that any disturbance could result in serious problems for the entire family. "Girls, today is a very important day for my work, so I need you to stay very quiet here," Sarah said, checking the door locks once more. "Don't leave here for anything, all right? I promise I'll make it up to you tomorrow with a special outing." The meeting began promptly at 2 in the afternoon, with men in expensive suits arriving in luxury cars and being greeted by Richard at the main entrance of the mansion. Sarah discreetly observed from the kitchen window, watching him greet each guest with the natural elegance that had always impressed her, demonstrating the same aristocratic courtesy that had won her over at the hospital years ago. During the following 2 hours, she worked silently in the kitchen and distant rooms, preparing and serving refreshments, organizing documents as requested, and keeping everything running perfectly without ever approaching the room where the meeting was taking place. The fragments of conversation she could hear revealed that Richard had become an even more successful businessman, expanding the inherited businesses and creating new investment opportunities that impressed even experienced partners. His voice sounded confident and mature, demonstrating a natural leadership that perfectly matched the responsibilities he had assumed after Margaret's death. Sarah found herself feeling involuntary pride in the man he had become, even knowing she had no right to such feelings after all the years of separation and the painful circumstances that had driven them apart. "He has become exactly the brilliant man I knew he would be," thought Sarah, hearing his voice directing the meeting with competence. Margaret would be proud to see how he has taken over the family business with such skill. While Sarah worked in the kitchen preparing a special snack that had been requested for the end of the meeting, the triplets were in the staff house trying to keep themselves occupied as promised to their mother. Emma was trying to read a book borrowed from school. Jessica was drawing on a sheet of paper, and Alice was looking out the window observing the magnificent gardens that extended around the property. The sight of the perfectly maintained gardens, with ornamental fountains, colorful flower beds and century-old trees creating inviting shadows, was irresistible to 3 girls who had spent years playing in a dirt yard and dangerous streets of the outskirts. Alice began convincing her sisters that they could take just a quick look at the gardens, promising they would stay away from the main house and return before their mother noticed their absence. Emma, always the most responsible, tried to remind them of the promise made to their mother, but childish curiosity and the irresistible beauty of the garden overcame caution. Jessica was the first to open the door, followed by Alice and finally by Emma, who decided to accompany her sisters to ensure they wouldn't get into serious trouble. The 3 girls quietly left the staff house and walked in wonder through the gardens, fascinated by the beauty and luxury they had never personally experienced. Look at this beautiful fountain. And these flowers are prettier than those in fairy tale books, whispered Alice, carefully approaching the central fountain. I've never seen a garden as perfect as this. Richard was feeling suffocated by the formal atmosphere of the prolonged meeting and decided to take a break for fresh air in the garden, leaving the investors discussing financial details in the meeting room. He exited through the main door and walked slowly through the gardens he had known since childhood, breathing deeply, the air perfumed by flowers and feeling the gentle breeze that always helped him relax during moments of stress. He was absorbed in thoughts about business and the important decisions he needed to make when he heard childish laughter coming from the direction of the ornamental fountain in the center of the garden. Curious, he approached silently and saw 3 identical girls playing near the water, their cheerful voices echoing in the afternoon air. They were beautiful, with shiny dark hair, expressive eyes, and an air of innocence that touched him immediately. Richard stood watching for a few minutes, smiling involuntarily at seeing the genuine joy of children discovering the beauty of the garden. When they noticed him, instead of running away frightened as he expected, they approached smiling without fear or shyness, as if they recognized in him someone familiar and trustworthy. It was when they extended their hands to greet him that Richard saw something that made his world completely stop. Each of the 3 girls had a crescent moon-shaped birthmark on their right wrist, exactly identical to the mark he had carried on his neck since birth. "Daddy, we have your birthmark," shouted the delighted triplets, showing their wrists and pointing to his neck. "Look, we're just like you." At that exact moment, Sarah appeared running desperately through the garden, having discovered her daughter's absence and imagining the disaster their disobedience could cause. She had frantically searched for the girls in the staff house before realizing they had disobeyed instructions and gone out to explore the gardens. When she saw her 3 daughters talking animatedly with Richard near the fountain, her heart almost stopped with terror and despair. The scene seemed like a nightmare come true. Her daughters, who carried physical proof of a denied paternity, innocently talking with the man who didn't know of their existence, making exactly the comments about birthmarks she had begged them to avoid. Sarah ran faster than she had ever run in her life, desperately shouting for the girls to come back, but knowing it was already too late to avoid the confrontation she had feared for 8 long and painful years. "Girls, come here now!" shouted Sarah in absolute panic, running toward the group near the fountain. "Come back here immediately." Richard slowly raised his eyes from the faces of the 3 girls to the woman who was running desperately in his direction, and felt as if time had completely stopped around him. The voice that was shouting was unmistakably familiar, even after 8 years of absence, and when he focused on the face of the approaching woman, he immediately recognized the features he had loved more than his own life. Sarah was thinner, with shorter hair and signs of fatigue on her face, but her eyes remained the same expressive eyes that had won him over at the hospital years ago. The realization that Sarah was there, in his own home caring for 3 daughters, who apparently carried his birthmark, created such intense mental confusion that Richard had difficulty forming coherent thoughts. He was paralyzed between the joy of seeing her again, the anger over the circumstances of her departure, the confusion about the children's presence, and most of all, the shock of discovering that perhaps everything he had believed about his sterility and Sarah's betrayal was completely false. "Sarah, how?" stammered Richard, alternating his gaze between her and the 3 girls who were watching him with curiosity. "What's happening here? These children, they..." The moment of silent shock in the garden seemed to last an eternity, with Richard and Sarah staring fixedly at each other, while the triplets observed the tension between the adults without fully understanding what was happening. Sarah reached where they were, breathless and with a face pale with terror, trying to hold her daughter's hands to take them away before the situation became even more complicated. Richard, still processing the impossible reality that Sarah was there, working in his house, with 3 girls who apparently carried his birthmark, struggled to form coherent words. The triplets, sensing the tension in the air but not understanding its origin, looked alternately at their desperate mother and at the handsome man who had reacted so strangely upon seeing their birthmarks. Emma, always the most observant, was the first to make the connection between Richard's reaction and the photo they had found in the suitcase. her intelligent eyes mentally comparing the face of the man before her with the image of the young man in love in the old photograph. The situation was quickly slipping out of Sarah's control, who knew she could no longer avoid the confrontation she had feared for 8 long and painful years. "Sarah, we need to talk right now." "I won't let you leave here without explaining to me what's going on," said Richard, his voice trembling between authority and desperate plea. "These girls, they have my birthmark. How is this possible?" Richard instructed that the investors should be attended by his assistants and that the meeting be rescheduled for another day, claiming a family emergency that could not be postponed. With firm but gentle hands, he guided Sarah and the triplets through the mansion to his private library, an intimate environment that had always been his personal refuge in moments of greatest need. The library was exactly as Sarah had imagined years ago when Richard described his moments of reading and reflection. Walls covered with noble wood shelves filled with books, comfortable leather armchairs positioned near a softly crackling fireplace, and an atmosphere of tranquility that dramatically contrasted with the emotional chaos everyone was experiencing. The triplets, impressed with the grandeur of the environment, walked silently between the shelves, delicately touching the books with the instinctive reverence of children who recognize something special and valuable. Sarah remained near the door, as if ready to flee at any moment, her hands visibly trembling while she watched Richard carefully close the door behind them. The privacy of the environment made the situation even more intense, removing any possibility of escape or external distraction. "This place is amazing. There are more books here than in our school library," Jessica murmured, running her fingers along the leather-bound volumes. "Have you read all these books?" The triplets, with the natural curiosity of children and without fully understanding the gravity of the situation, began asking direct questions that went straight to the heart of the issue everyone was avoiding addressing openly. Emma approached Richard, and with the frankness typical of an 8-year-old, asked if he was really their father, since he had the same birthmark they carried. Jessica added that their mother always said their father was far away, but never explained where or why, and that they had always dreamed of meeting him. Alice, the most sensitive of the trio, observed that Sarah seemed very frightened and asked if they had done something wrong by talking about the birthmarks. Richard knelt to the girl's height, looking deeply into each one's eyes and seeing reflections of himself that were impossible to deny. The resemblance was not just in the physical mark, but also in the facial features, bone structure, and especially in the intelligent expression of the eyes that constantly reminded him of his childhood photographs. Each passing second made it more evident that these children were his daughters, a reality that contradicted everything he had believed about his medical condition and about the circumstances of Sarah's departure years ago. "Girls, I don't know yet how to answer that question, but I promise we'll discover the truth together," said Richard, gently touching each one's face. "First, I need to talk with your mother about some very important things from the past." Sarah, cornered by the situation and realizing there was no more avoiding the confrontation, asked the triplets to sit in the children's reading area that Richard had prepared in a corner of the library, promising that she would soon explain everything they wanted to know. With a trembling voice and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, she began to tell Richard the truth she had been forced to hide during 8 terrible years of solitude and struggle. Her words came out interspersed with sobs as she reported in detail the devastating events that had begun with Margaret's discovery of their relationship at the hospital. Richard listened in growing silent horror as Sarah described the invasive investigation, the illegally obtained medical records, and especially the terrifying summons to the law office where she had been humiliated and blackmailed by his mother's ruthless lawyers. Each detail of the story revealed a systematic cruelty that Richard had never imagined his mother capable of orchestrating, a manipulation so elaborate and cruel that it had destroyed not only their relationship, but also 8 years of Sarah's life and the daughters he never knew existed. The revelation that Margaret had forged a fake letter, making Sarah appear to be a gold-digging adventuress, was the moment when Richard felt such intense anger toward his own mother that he needed to lean against the wall to avoid collapsing. "They threatened me with prison if I didn't sign those horrible documents, Richard. They said they would prosecute my sick mother as an accomplice," sobbed Sarah, tears flowing freely down her face. "I had no choice. I couldn't risk her life and the babies growing in my womb." The triplets, observing their mother cry in a way they had never witnessed before, approached instinctively to console her, hugging her legs and asking what was happening. Sarah, through tears, explained to her daughters that the man before them was probably their father, but that bad people had lied and separated them when they were still in their mother's womb. Emma, with her precocious maturity, asked if that was why they had always been poor, and if that was why their mother sometimes cried during the night when she thought they were sleeping. Jessica wanted to know if, now that they had found their father, they could be a real family like the other children at school. Alice simply nestled in Sarah's lap, offering the silent comfort she always gave when she noticed her mother was suffering. Richard observed the interaction between Sarah and the triplets, seeing for the first time the depth of the bond she had created with their daughters and the heroic sacrifice she had made to raise them alone in conditions of extreme difficulty. The realization that his daughters had grown up in poverty, suffering humiliations at school and constant deprivation, while he lived in wealth without knowing of their existence, created a devastating guilt that threatened to break his mental sanity. "Mommy, don't cry anymore. If he's our real daddy, then we can finally be happy," said Alice, drying the tears from Sarah's face with her small hands. "We always knew you were sad, even when you tried to hide it from us." Sarah continued her painful confession, describing the 8 years of struggle that followed. The forced move to the countryside, the premature birth of the triplets due to stress and malnutrition, the months of solitary care that almost killed her from exhaustion, and finally the return to the capital where she worked as a cleaner to support her daughters. She spoke about sleepless nights sewing clothes for other people, about the times she ate only one meal a day so the girls could have enough food, about the daily humiliations the triplets suffered at school due to visible poverty. Richard listened to every word with growing horror, realizing that while he lived comfortably, lamenting a loss that had been fabricated by his own mother, the woman he loved was heroically struggling to survive and raise their daughters alone. The cruel irony that Sarah had ended up working in his own house as a domestic servant after years trying to escape any connection with her past demonstrated how fate had conspired to finally reveal the truth. Each account of financial hardship, each description of maternal sacrifice, each tear that Sarah shed while telling her story increased Richard's determination to repair all the lost years and all the suffering caused by Margaret's cruel manipulation. "Sarah, my God, what my mother did to you, to our daughters, is unforgivable," said Richard, kneeling before her and taking her work-calloused hands. "I never knew, never imagined she was capable of such systematic and devastating cruelty." Richard then revealed his own painful truth. During the 8 years since he had received the false letter, claiming that Sarah had abandoned him for another man, he had never been able to forget the love he felt for her or fully accept the version of events presented by his mother. He had remained single, refusing all the relationships that Margaret had tried to arrange, always with the secret hope that one day he would discover the truth about what had really happened. Richard confessed that he had hired private investigators years ago to try to find Sarah, but they had never been able to locate her due to the false name she had been forced to use and the move to the countryside. He revealed that he had kept all the memories of their relationship, photographs, small gifts, even the dried flowers from the hospital garden where they met, in a locked box in his room, as a sanctuary for a love he had never been able to overcome. Margaret's death 2 years ago had been simultaneously a relief and a torment, as he had lost the only person who could confirm or deny his suspicions about the truth of the events that separated them. Now, with Sarah before him and 3 daughters who were obviously his, Richard realized that all the suffering of the last 8 years had been based on an elaborate lie by a woman he loved as a mother, but who had revealed herself to be a monster of manipulation and control. "Sarah, I never stopped loving you. I never managed to accept that everything we lived together had been a lie," confessed Richard, tears running down his face. "I knew deep down in my heart that something was wrong with that letter and with that whole story." Sarah showed Richard the visible emotional marks of years of struggle: hands calloused by heavy work, scars from iron burns, the curved posture of someone who spent years cleaning floors on her knees, and especially the eyes that had lost the brightness of youth due to constant suffering. She explained how she had lost the ability to work as a nurse due to the psychological trauma caused by lawyers, how she had developed panic attacks in hospitals, and how she had been forced to accept cleaning jobs that paid a fraction of what she earned before. Sarah revealed the constant fear she had carried for 8 years, that one day Richard would discover the existence of their daughters and try to take them away from her, using his wealth and power to prove that a poor mother could not properly care for children who deserved a better life. She confessed that she had accepted the job at the mansion only because she was desperate to give her daughters a decent education, even knowing the risk of being discovered, and that she had spent every day of the last week terrified by the possibility of being recognized and humiliated again. Sarah's complete vulnerability, exposing not only her physical wounds but also her deepest fears and emotional traumas, touched Richard in a way he had never experienced, creating a mixture of renewed love, anger against his mother, and absolute determination to repair all the lost years. "Richard, I'm so afraid you'll think I'm not good enough to raise your daughters, now that you know of their existence," whispered Sarah, her voice broken with emotion. "They deserve so much more than I could give, but they're all I have in the world." The transformation in Richard's expression was immediate and powerful when he realized that Sarah still carried the fear of being rejected or considered inadequate after years of heroic sacrifice raising their daughters alone. He stood up and walked to an antique desk where he kept important documents, retrieving a folder containing recent medical exams he had done as part of a routine checkup 6 months ago. With trembling hands, he showed Sarah the results that proved his sterility condition had been temporary, caused by an aggressive medical treatment he had received in adolescence, and that his fertility had completely normalized years ago. The doctors had explained that cases like his were rare, but not impossible, and that natural hormonal changes over the years could reverse conditions that seemed permanent. Richard revealed that he had discovered this information months ago, but at the time had not given importance to the fact, because he believed he would never find Sarah again or have the chance to start a family with the only woman he had ever truly loved. Now, with the medical evidence that he could have children and 3 girls before him, who obviously carried his genes, the reality of fatherhood became not just possible, but unquestionable. He immediately proposed to do paternity tests to officially confirm what was already evident to anyone who observed them together, not because he doubted Sarah's word, but because he wanted her to have all the legal documentation necessary to protect their daughter's rights. "Sarah, look at these exams. My condition was temporary, not permanent, as we believed. I can have children, I always could in recent years," said Richard, showing the medical documents. "These girls are my daughters, I have no doubt, but let's do all the necessary tests so that you have all possible legal protection." The paternity tests were conducted the next day at a private laboratory trusted by Richard, and the results confirmed with 99.9% certainty that Emma, Jessica, and Alice were his biological daughters. When the results arrived a week later, Richard gathered Sarah and the triplets in the library again, where he officially read the results that legally proved the paternity that was already emotionally obvious. The triplets, who had spent the week getting to know Richard better and becoming accustomed to the idea of finally having a father, celebrated the confirmation with shouts of joy that echoed throughout the mansion. Sarah cried tears of relief, not because she doubted the paternity, but because she finally had the official documentation that would protect her daughters and legally confirm that they were entitled to the name, inheritance, and protection of the family. Richard then did something that surprised everyone. He knelt before Sarah in the presence of their daughters, asking forgiveness not only for the lost years, but also for all the suffering his family had caused. He solemnly promised that he would dedicate the rest of his life to repairing the harm that had been done, to provide his daughters with all the opportunities they had missed during the first 8 years of their lives, and especially to rebuild the love and trust that Margaret had destroyed with her cruel manipulations. "Sarah, I beg for your forgiveness for the 8 years stolen from our lives. I promise I will spend every day of the rest of my existence compensating for the suffering that you and our daughters went through," Richard said, still on his knees. "You are the strongest and most courageous woman I have ever known, and our daughters are living proof of your unconditional love and dedication." The wedding ceremony took place 3 months later, in an intimate but moving celebration where the triplets served as bridesmaids, wearing identical white lace dresses that Richard had specially made for them. Sarah wore a simple but elegant dress, her face radiating a happiness she hadn't felt for 8 years, as she walked down the aisle of the small chapel to the sound of soft music played by a string quartet. The girls had insisted on carrying rings and flower petals, actively participating in the ceremony that formalized not only their parents' marriage, but also the legal formation of the family that had always existed in their hearts. Richard had taken care of all the details, from the legal documentation that formalized his paternity and gave the girls his surname, to the creation of education funds that would guarantee the academic future of all three, regardless of any circumstance. He had also hired the best psychologists to help Sarah process the trauma of her years of struggle, and to help the triplets adapt to their new reality of wealth and opportunities. The ceremony was small but perfect, with only a few close friends and loyal mansion staff as witnesses, all moved to see a family finally reunited after years of forced separation. When the officiant pronounced Richard and Sarah husband and wife, the triplets shouted with joy and ran to hug their parents, creating a moment of pure happiness that symbolically erased all the years of suffering and separation. "Finally, we're a real family. Now we have Mommy, Daddy, and we'll never be separated again," shouted Emma, hugging both parents simultaneously. "This is the best thing that has ever happened in our entire life." Life in the mansion was completely transformed with the official presence of Sarah and the triplets as Richard's legitimate family. The girls received individual rooms decorated according to their unique personalities. Emma chose a library theme with shelves full of books and a desk for studying. Jessica opted for sports decor with trophies and equipment for her favorite physical activities, and Alice created an art studio with easels, paints, and materials to develop her artistic talent. Sarah gradually assumed the role of lady of the house, working alongside Richard in managing the family business and discovering that her experience in organization and caring for people translated perfectly to managing a large and complex property. She never returned to work as a nurse due to the trauma she still carried, but found personal fulfillment helping Richard with philanthropic projects that benefited families in situations similar to what she had faced. The triplets quickly adapted to a life of privilege, but maintained the humility and compassion that Sarah had taught them during the difficult years, often asking to visit Catherine and other neighbors from their old home in the suburbs. Richard proved to be a dedicated and loving father, making up for the lost years with constant attention, active participation in his daughter's education, and most importantly, creating happy memories that gradually replaced the painful memories of the girls' first 8 years of life. "Daddy, can you teach us how to ride horses tomorrow? And then we can have a picnic in the garden like a normal family," Jessica asked during dinner. "We want to do all the things we always dreamed of doing with a real father." The triplets, now 9 years old and flourishing in all aspects of their lives, ran freely through the mansion gardens, their laughter echoing cheerfully through the air as they played hide-and-seek among the century-old trees. Emma had become one of the best students at her new private school, developing a special talent for mathematics and science, with plans already formed to become a doctor, as her mother had dreamed of being. Jessica excelled in sports and leadership, organizing friendly competitions among colleagues and demonstrating the same courageous spirit that had helped her protect her sisters during difficult years. Alice had discovered an exceptional talent for painting and music, creating artwork that proudly decorated the mansion walls and playing piano during family gatherings. Richard and Sarah watched their daughters play from the main terrace of the mansion, embraced and finally at peace after years of suffering apart. Sarah had regained the sparkle in her eyes and the genuine smile that Richard had loved since their first meeting at the hospital, while he had found the purpose and completeness he always knew would only exist alongside her and the family they had created together. The love that had survived 8 years of separation, manipulation, and suffering had become even stronger, tempered by adversity and purified by the truth finally revealed. "Dad, Mom, come play with us in the garden. We want to show you the treehouse we built," the triplets shouted in unison, waving energetically. "We're the happiest family in the whole world, and we want everyone to know." Years had passed since the wedding, and the mansion had never been so full of life as on that spring morning. Sarah gently held in her arms her newborn son, Benjamin, a dark-haired boy who had come into the world just 5 days ago, definitively completing the family she and Richard had dreamed of building. The baby slept peacefully wrapped in a blanket, embroidered by the triplets themselves, who had spent weeks preparing special gifts to welcome their little brother. Richard sat in the armchair next to the bed, observing with infinite tenderness the scene that represented the complete fulfillment of all his dreams. The soft morning light illuminated the environment with an atmosphere of serenity that contrasted with the painful memories of the past. "He's perfect, Sarah." "Our son is absolutely perfect, just like you," Richard murmured, gently kissing his wife's forehead. "We finally have our complete family, exactly as we always dreamed it would be." The triplets, now 12 years old, had taken on the role of older sisters with adorable seriousness. Emma had become the official organizer, creating schedules to help with the baby, from diaper changes to bottle preparation. Jessica had assumed the role of Benjamin's official entertainment, singing invented lullabies and making faces that drew smiles from the baby. Alice had painted an elaborate mural on the bedroom wall, depicting a happy family playing in a flowery garden. The 3 girls actively participated in the preparations, from decoration to choosing clothes, demonstrating emotional maturity that was the result of the love and stability they finally had. Each wore on her wrist the birthmark that eternally connected them to their father, but now that mark represented a symbol of belonging to a united and happy family. "Can I hold Benjamin now, Mum?" "I promise I'll be very careful," Emma asked, extending her arms. "I practiced with the doll that Dad bought, and I know exactly how to hold his little head." Sarah watched emotionally as her daughters cared for their younger brother with dedication that surpassed many adults. They had created shifts to help during the night, taking turns to rock Benjamin when he cried, allowing Sarah to rest properly. Jessica had become an expert at calming the baby through rhythmic movement and improvised songs. Alice had discovered that Benjamin calmed down when she played the piano softly, creating sweet melodies for naps. Emma had taken responsibility for keeping a diary of her brother's development, recording each smile and new movement. The triplets' union had strengthened family bonds, creating a dynamic where each member contributed to the collective well-being. Richard observed these interactions with admiration, realizing that his daughters had inherited the capacity for unconditional love. "Look, Dad, Benjamin smiled when I sang that song you used to sing to us," Jessica exclaimed, gently rocking the baby. "I think he already recognizes our family and knows he's safe here with us." The family routine had naturally adapted to the new member. Richard reorganized his schedule to spend more time at home, participating in morning baths and evening sessions where he read stories to Benjamin. The triplets created a special notebook with letters for their younger brother, telling about daily activities and future plans, expressing the immense love they felt. Sarah followed these demonstrations with infinite gratitude, remembering how life had changed since the dark days of raising the triplets alone in poverty. Benjamin was born into a stable and loving family, surrounded by people who would love him unconditionally and ensure all the opportunities that his sisters had missed in their early years. "I'll teach everything to Benjamin when he grows up," promised Alice, caressing the baby's tiny hand. "I'll show him how to paint, play the piano, and tell him how lucky we are to have the best parents in the world." Catherine, now 73, had become the official honorary grandmother, visiting regularly and offering advice on baby care. She cried with emotion when she met Benjamin, holding him with the tenderness of someone who understood the miracle it represented for Sarah to have a child in an environment of love and stability. During visits, she helped with household chores and offered maternal wisdom that only someone with similar experiences could provide. Benjamin instinctively recognized Catherine's kindness, calming down when she held him and sang old songs. Her presence represented a connection to the past of struggle, constantly reminding them how much they had achieved. "Sarah, dear, look at this beautiful baby and these wonderful girls," said Catherine, cradling Benjamin. "You deserve all this happiness, and your mother would be so proud of the strong woman you've become." The sunset found the family gathered in the garden, where they prepared a special picnic to celebrate Benjamin's first week. Sarah was on a soft blanket, nursing the baby while watching Richard play with the triplets in a soccer match that filled the air with cheerful laughter. The scene represented the complete fulfillment of all the dreams she had cherished during years of loneliness. United family, healthy children, loving husband, and security that ensured they would never face hardship again. Benjamin slept peacefully, oblivious to the symbolic importance of his existence as proof that true love overcame any obstacle. The triplets ran freely, their laughter echoing through the garden, representing the transformation of girls who had known poverty into confident young people surrounded by endless opportunities. "Daddy, Mommy, Benjamin girls," whispered Sarah, observing her family with infinite gratitude. "We finally have everything we've always dreamed of: true love, complete unity, and a bright future ahead." Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll be waiting for you there.